The message arrived at midnight when Commander Lissa Chen was eating cold noodles in her quarters aboard the cargo freighter Meridian's Hope, and she read it 3 times before she believed it was real. The Galactic Union had finally agreed to evaluate humanity for Tier 1 species status, and they wanted a human representative to prove their worth through something called the Deathworld Conditioning Trials on Station Corvth Prime, a place she had only heard about in whispered rumors among veteran soldiers who spoke of it like a haunted graveyard where careers went to die. She set down her chopsticks and stared at the holographic display floating above her wrist communicator, watching the official seal of the Velori High Council pulse with cold blue light, and she felt something stir in her chest that she had not felt in years, something that might have been excitement, or might have been the universe finally giving her a chance to matter. Humanity had been stuck at Tier 3 status for over a century, which meant no voting rights in the Union Assembly, no territorial claims beyond their home system, and no respect from the elder species who looked at humans the way humans might look at clever animals who had learned a few tricks but would never truly belong at the table of civilized beings. Lissa had grown up hearing her grandmother talk about the old days before first contact, when humans thought they were alone in the universe and believed they were special. And then the Velori ships appeared in Earth's sky, and everything changed forever, not with war or destruction, but with something worse, with pity and dismissal, and the quiet suggestion that humans should be grateful they were allowed to exist at all. She accepted the invitation that same night and requested transport to Corvth Prime on the next available vessel. And 2 weeks later, she stood in a docking bay that stretched larger than any structure she had ever seen, watching ships from 100 different worlds come and go like insects around a hive. The station itself was a marvel of engineering that made human achievements look like children playing with blocks, a massive ring structure orbiting a dying star, its surface covered with towers and domes and structures that defied her understanding of physics, and everywhere she looked there were aliens of species she had never encountered and might never encounter again. A Velori delegation was waiting for her at the customs checkpoint, and at their head stood Ambassador Sithrak, a 7-foot insectoid being with compound eyes that reflected her image 1,000 times and mandibles that clicked together when he spoke through his translation device. "Commander Chen," he said, and his voice came through the device flat and emotionless, though she could see something in his posture that looked very much like contempt. "We are surprised you accepted our invitation so quickly, and we must inform you that the trials have a completion rate of less than 4% across all species who have attempted them." Lissa looked up at him and felt no fear, because fear was something she had used up long ago on a colony ship called the Wandering Star when she was 9 years old and watched her parents die in the cold vacuum of space, and nothing since then had ever managed to scare her quite as much as that memory. "I understand the risks," she said, keeping her voice steady and professional, "and I am ready to begin whenever you see fit." Sithrak's mandibles clicked rapidly, which she would later learn was the Velori equivalent of laughter, and he gestured for her to follow him through a series of corridors that twisted and turned in ways that made her dizzy, until they reached a chamber filled with holographic displays showing images of fire and ice and darkness. "These are the Deathworld conditioning trials," he explained, and there was something almost gleeful in the way he described each stage. "Designed by our ancestors 300 years ago to test the limits of biological endurance and psychological resilience, and no species from a Class 7 world has ever completed Stage 3. She studied the images carefully, noting the volcanic landscapes and the flooded tunnels and the isolation chambers that looked like coffins, and she filed each detail away in her mind the way she had learned to do during her military training. "Class 7, she repeated, "that is Earth's classification." "Indeed," Sithrak confirmed. "A middling world with moderate conditions, neither hostile nor welcoming, producing species of average capability and limited potential, which is why we were reluctant to extend this opportunity, though the Union Council insisted we give humanity a chance to prove themselves. Lissa wanted to argue, wanted to tell him about Earth's hurricanes and earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, about the predators that stalked the jungles and the bacteria that waged invisible wars inside every living body, about the ice ages and the mass extinctions, and the constant struggle for survival that had shaped her species for millions of years. But she held her tongue because words would prove nothing. Only action would matter here, only results would speak. Sithrak led her to a small chamber where she would stay until the trials began, and as he turned to leave, she asked him one question that made him pause in confusion. "Will there be food?" He turned back, his compound eyes glittering with what might have been curiosity, and his mandibles clicked slowly as he processed her question. "Food will be provided as a reward at the completion of each stage," he said. "Though most candidates find themselves unable to eat due to exhaustion or injury or psychological trauma, and I must say this is an unusual question for someone facing the greatest challenge of their life." "I think better when I am not hungry," Lissa said, and she sat down on the narrow bed and began reviewing the trial information on her datapad, as if she were preparing for a routine training exercise rather than something that had broken countless beings before her. Sithrak lingered in the doorway for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that felt almost scientific, and then he left without another word, his footsteps clicking against the metal floor until they faded into silence. Lissa read through the trial protocols for hours, memorizing every detail she could find, and when the station's artificial lights dimmed to simulate night, she lay back on her bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about home. She thought about Earth with its blue oceans and green forests and cities that sparkled like jewels at night, about the billions of humans going about their daily lives without knowing that their entire future might depend on what happened here, about the children who would grow up either as equals among the stars or as second-class citizens, forever looked down upon by beings who had never faced the challenges that Earth threw at its children every single day. She thought about her parents and the way they had smiled at her before pushing her into the escape pod, the last image she had of them before the colony's ship's hull breached and the cold darkness took them away. And she felt that old familiar ache in her chest that never quite went away no matter how many years passed. But she did not cry, because she had no tears left for the past, only determination for the future. Tomorrow the trials would begin, and she would either prove that humanity deserved respect or she would die trying, and either way she would face it the same way she had faced everything since that terrible day when she was 9, with her eyes open and her spine straight and her hunger driving her forward. She closed her eyes and fell into a dreamless sleep, and when she woke the next morning she ate the bland ration bar that had been left outside her door and prepared herself for whatever horrors awaited. The Velori thought they knew what would break a human, but they had never met Lissa Chen, and they had no idea what Earth had already put her through. The transport shuttle carried Lissa and 11 other candidates to a manufactured moon called the Crucible, and through the viewport she could see a world that looked like something from a nightmare. Half the surface glowing orange with volcanic fire, and the other half shrouded in perpetual darkness. She studied her fellow candidates during the flight, sizing them up the way she had learned to assess threats and allies during her years of military service. The Morathi were crystalline beings whose bodies caught the light and scattered it into rainbows, beautiful and fragile-looking, though she knew from her research that they came from a world of extreme cold and could survive temperatures that would freeze human blood solid. The Delphine were aquatic creatures with sleek gray skin and large dark eyes. Their bodies kept moist by specialized suits that pumped water across their gills, and they moved with a fluid grace that made her think of dolphins back on Earth. The Grothak was massive, standing nearly 3 meters tall with 4 arms and skin like weathered stone, and he introduced himself as Kravik in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder, telling her that his people were warriors who had never known defeat. "And what are you?" asked a Morathi candidate whose name translated roughly as Glittering Dawn, and her voice chimed like wind through crystal as she examined Lissa with obvious curiosity. "I have never seen your species before." "Human," Lissa replied, "from Earth." "Earth," Glittering Dawn repeated. "I do not know this world, but you seem very small and soft, and I wonder how you expect to survive what is coming." Lissa just shrugged and looked out the viewport at the hellscape growing larger below them, and she said nothing because she had learned long ago that small and soft were not the same as weak. The shuttle landed on a platform of black rock surrounded by rivers of molten lava, and the heat hit them like a physical force the moment the doors opened, making several candidates stagger backward in shock. A Velori observer stood waiting for them, protected by a personal shield that shimmered around her like a soap bubble, and she explained the rules of Stage 1 in a voice that carried no emotion. "This is the Burning Flats," she announced, "a volcanic wasteland where surface temperatures exceed 70 degrees by your standard measurements, and you must cross 30 kilometers to reach the checkpoint on the far side, and you have 12 hours to complete this stage or you will be disqualified." Lissa stripped off her outer jacket immediately, leaving only her thermal underlayer that was designed to wick moisture away from her skin, and the other candidates watched her with confusion as she tied the jacket around her waist. "What are you doing?" Kravik demanded, his stone skin already starting to crack from the heat. "You will burn without protection." "The jacket traps heat," she explained. "My body needs to release it, and I have a cooling system that your species does not." She began to sweat, and the Morathi nearest to her made a sound of disgust at the sight of liquid beading on her skin and dripping down her face, but Lissa ignored them and started walking toward the distant checkpoint. The first hour was brutal, and the heat pressed against her like a living thing trying to crush the breath from her lungs, but she kept moving at a steady pace and rationed her water carefully, and focused on putting one foot in front of the other. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of candidates struggling, the crack of Morathi crystals fracturing in the heat, the desperate gasps of Delphine whose suits could not cool them fast enough, the groans of Kravik whose people had never evolved for such temperatures. 3 candidates collapsed before the halfway point and had to be evacuated by emergency shuttles, and Lissa did not look back as they were carried away, because she could not afford to waste energy on things she could not change. She finished the Burning Flats in the top 3, crossing the checkpoint line alongside Kravik and a Delphine called Swift Current, who had somehow managed to keep her suit functioning despite the heat. The Velori observers recorded their times with expressions that Lissa could not read, but she noticed them conferring quietly among themselves and gesturing toward her with what might have been surprise. She ate her reward ration pack slowly, savoring every bite despite the bland taste, and she rested for exactly 4 hours before the next stage began. Stage 2 was called the Drowning Dark, and it was everything the name promised and worse. The candidates were dropped into a network of underground tunnels that stretched beneath the crucible's surface, tunnels that flooded without warning and were home to creatures that had evolved in absolute darkness to hunt by sensing vibration and body heat. The moment Lissa entered the tunnels, she understood why this stage had broken so many before her. The darkness was complete and absolute, so thick that she could not see her own hand in front of her face, and the walls pressed in close enough to scrape her shoulders as she moved. She heard Kravik's booming voice somewhere behind her, echoing through the tunnels with a note of panic that surprised her, and she realized that the massive warrior was terrified of enclosed spaces in a way that the Burning Flats had not revealed. "Keep moving," she called back to him. "Focus on your breathing and keep moving forward." But the tunnels were not designed to let anyone focus, because just as she began to find a rhythm, the water came, cold and fast and rising with terrifying speed, until it reached her chest and then her chin, and then there was nothing to breathe but liquid darkness. Lissa held her breath and kept moving, running her fingers along the tunnel wall to guide herself, and she counted the seconds in her head the way she had trained herself to do during underwater exercises back on Earth. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4. Her lungs burned and her vision sparkled with lights that were not real, but she had practiced this, had pushed her body to its limits in training pools and ocean depths, and she knew exactly how much longer she could last. The tunnel rose suddenly, and her head broke the surface, and she gasped air into her starving lungs with a sound that echoed in the darkness like a prayer of thanks. But she was not alone in these tunnels, and she learned this the hard way when something long and sinuous wrapped around her leg and bit down with teeth like needles. She did not scream because screaming would waste oxygen, and instead she reached down into the black water and found the creature's head and drove her thumbs into what she hoped were its eyes. The thing thrashed and released her leg and disappeared back into the depths, leaving her bleeding from a dozen puncture wounds that burned with what might have been venom or might have been simple infection. She kept moving because stopping meant dying, and she navigated by touch and sound, and the strange instinct that humans had developed over millions of years of surviving in hostile environments. Behind her, she could hear other candidates screaming as the creatures found them, could hear the splash of bodies falling and the gurgle of lungs filling with water, and she forced herself not to think about how many would not make it out. When she finally emerged from the tunnel network into the dim gray light of the crucible's surface, she found only 4 other candidates waiting at the checkpoint. Kravik was not among them, and she learned later that he had withdrawn from the trials rather than face the darkness again. The Valori observers approached her as medical drones treated the wounds on her leg, and she could see something new in their compound eyes that had not been there before. "You killed a razorial with your bare hands," one of them said, and it was not a question but a statement of disbelief. "These creatures have neurotoxic venom that paralyzes most species within seconds." "It hurt," Lissa admitted, wincing as the medical drone cleaned her wounds. "But I have been hurt before, and pain is just information that tells you something is wrong. It does not have to stop you from acting." The observer stared at her for a long moment, mandibles clicking in that rapid pattern she now recognized as Valori uncertainty, and then turned away to record observations that Lissa suspected were being transmitted directly to the High Council. She ate her reward ration and rested and prepared herself for Stage 3, because she knew from her research that the worst was yet to come, and whatever the crucible threw at her next would make the burning flats and the drowning dark seem like warm-up exercises. But she was still standing, still hungry, still human, and that would have to be enough. Stage 3 was called the Harvest, and the name alone made Lissa uneasy in a way that the physical challenges had not. The Valori observer who briefed the remaining 5 candidates spoke with something that might have been respect or might have been warning, explaining that this stage would not test their bodies but their minds. "You will enter isolation pods equipped with neural interface technology," she explained, "and for 72 hours you will experience simulations drawn from your own memories and fears, designed to find the weakest point in your psyche and apply pressure until something breaks." Lissa looked at the pods arranged in a circle at the center of the chamber, sleek black coffins, with cables snaking from their sides and displays that showed brainwave patterns in pulsing colors. "What kind of simulations?" asked Swift Current, the Delphine who had survived the drowning dark alongside Lissa, and her voice trembled in a way it had not when she was fighting for air in flooded tunnels. "Different for each candidate," the observer replied. "The neural interface reads your deepest memories and constructs scenarios based on your personal traumas and terrors, and the simulation adapts in real time to maximize psychological impact." Glittering Dawn made a sound like breaking glass, which Lissa had learned was the Morathi expression of fear, and 2 of the other candidates exchanged glances that suggested they were considering withdrawal. "What happens if we break?" Lissa asked, and her voice came out steady despite the cold feeling spreading through her chest. "You will be extracted and treated for psychological damage," the observer said, "though recovery is not guaranteed, and some candidates have never fully returned to their previous mental state. This stage has a 40% permanent casualty rate among those who enter." The candidates were given 1 hour to prepare, and Lissa spent that time sitting alone in a corner of the chamber with her eyes closed, doing something she had avoided for 15 years, thinking about the wandering star. She had been 9 years old when the colony ship's engines failed mid-jump, tearing a hole in the hull that spread across 3 decks before the emergency bulkheads could seal it, and she had been eating dinner with her parents when the alarm started screaming. Her father had grabbed her hand, and her mother had grabbed her father's hand, and they had run together through corridors filled with smoke and screaming, and the terrible sound of metal tearing apart, and they had made it to the escape pod bay just as the section they were in began to decompress. There had been only one pod left and room inside for only one person, and her parents had not hesitated. They had pushed her inside and sealed the door and smiled at her through the tiny window as the air was ripped from their lungs. She had watched them die, watched their faces turn blue and their eyes go empty, and the last thing she saw before the pod ejected was her mother mouthing words that might have been, "We love you," or might have been, "Survive." Lissa opened her eyes and stood up and walked to her assigned pod without looking at the other candidates, because she knew now what the simulation would show her, knew that she was about to live through that moment again and again for 72 hours. The pod closed around her like a tomb, and darkness swallowed her, and then the memories began. She was 9 years old again, sitting at the dinner table on the wandering star, and her mother was laughing at something her father had said, and the food was warm and the lights were bright, and everything was perfect for exactly 3 more seconds. The alarm screamed and her father grabbed her hand and they ran, and she felt every moment of it as if it were happening for the first time. The terror and the confusion and the desperate hope that somehow they would all make it out alive. They reached the pod bay and there was only one pod, and her parents pushed her inside, and the door sealed, and she screamed and beat her fists against the glass as she watched them die. The simulation reset and she was 9 years old again, sitting at the dinner table, and her mother was laughing. Again and again the memory played, sometimes exactly as it had happened and sometimes with terrible variations. Sometimes she escaped the pod and reached for her mother's hand and felt her fingers slip away. Sometimes the pod did not launch and she died alongside them. Sometimes she watched them die slowly instead of quickly and heard them scream her name. The hours blurred together into an endless nightmare of loss and grief and helpless rage, and somewhere deep inside her mind, a voice whispered that this would never end, that she would be trapped in this moment forever, that she might as well give up and let the darkness take her. But Lissa had already survived this once, and she discovered something strange as the simulation continued its assault. The memories could not hurt her more than they already had. She had carried this pain inside her for 15 years, had built walls around it and learned to function despite it, had transformed her grief into determination and her helplessness into strength, and the simulation could make her relive the worst moment of her life, but it could not make her feel it any deeper than she already did. The 72 hours passed like a fever dream, and when the pod finally opened and light flooded in, Lissa blinked and sat up and discovered that her cheeks were wet with tears she did not remember crying. The Valori medical team rushed toward her with scanners and sedatives, clearly expecting to find a broken shell of a being, but Lissa pushed past them and stood on shaky legs and looked around the chamber at the other pods. Glittering Dawn had been extracted at hour 23 and lay on a medical gurney with her crystalline body flickering in unstable patterns that suggested severe neurological damage. 2 of the other candidates had begged for release before the halfway point, and sat huddled in corners with vacant eyes and trembling hands. Only Swift Current had made it through, and she emerged from her pod looking like a ghost of herself, her gray skin pale and her dark eyes haunted by whatever she had seen. Ambassador Sithrak appeared in the doorway of the chamber, and Lissa could see the shock in his posture as he took in the scene. The broken candidates, the traumatized survivors, and the human woman who was walking toward the mess hall on unsteady legs. "Commander Chen," he called out, and she stopped and turned to face him. "You should be non-functional right now. The simulation identified your core trauma, the memory with the highest emotional intensity, and it exploited that memory for 72 hours straight." "I know," Lissa said, and her voice came out rough and tired but not broken. "I was there." "How are you intact?" Sithrak demanded, his mandibles clicking in a pattern of frustration and disbelief. "The simulation was designed to find the crack in your psyche and widen it until your mind shattered. How did you survive?" Lissa looked at him for a long moment, thinking about how to explain something that she was not sure she fully understood herself. "I have already lived through it once," she said finally. "Your simulation was not worse than my memory, because my memory was real, and your simulation was just a shadow of something I have been carrying inside me for 15 years. She turned and continued walking toward the mess hall, and Sithrak followed her with questions that she did not answer until she had found a table and sat down, and requested whatever passed for coffee on the station. "You experienced the death of your parental units," Sithrak said, sitting across from her with an expression that might have been attempting sympathy. "This is a significant trauma that should have rendered you psychologically vulnerable." "It did," Lissa agreed, wrapping her hands around the warm cup they brought her and taking a long sip of the bitter liquid. "But vulnerability is not the same as weakness, and trauma is not the same as defeat. Humans are not fragile despite what you believe." She ordered food and ate slowly while Sithrak watched her, and she could see the ambassador struggling to understand something that his species had never considered. That pain could make a creature stronger instead of weaker, that suffering could become a source of resilience instead of a wound that never healed. "What does your species call this?" he asked finally. "This ability to endure psychological damage and continue functioning." Lissa thought about it for a moment, chewing a mouthful of replicated protein that tasted like nothing at all. "We call it being human," she said, and she finished her meal while the ambassador sat in silence, trying to process a truth that his entire civilization had failed to understand. Word spread through Station Corvth Prime like fire through dry grass. The human was still standing. Observers from 18 different species requested access to the trial footage, and the viewing galleries that had been nearly empty at the start of the trials now overflowed with beings who wanted to see for themselves this strange creature from a world called Earth. The Velori High Council convened an emergency session in their central chamber, a massive dome decorated with trophies from 300 years of trials. And Ambassador Sithrak stood before the 7 council members with a holographic display floating beside him showing Lissa Chen's biometric data. "The human has completed Stage 3, he reported, and his voice carried a note of disbelief that he could not quite hide. "She emerged with full psychological function despite experiencing 72 hours of targeted trauma simulation." High Counselor Vethrix, the eldest of the Velori and the architect of the original trial protocols, leaned forward with compound eyes that had seen thousands of candidates break on the crucible. "This is impossible," she declared. "No species from a Class 7 world has ever completed Stage 3. The psychological resilience required simply does not develop in moderate environments." "I agree that it should be impossible," Sithrak replied, "which is why I have requested a full review of Earth's classification data." He gestured and the holographic display changed, showing a blue and green planet that looked peaceful and welcoming from orbit, and the council members examined it with expressions of confusion. "This is the human homeworld," Sithrak explained, "classified as a Class 7 moderate environment based on survey data collected during first contact over a century ago, and this classification has never been questioned or updated." "The classification seems appropriate," observed Councillor Thrix, the youngest member of the council. "The planet has liquid water, a breathable atmosphere, and surface temperatures within comfortable ranges. It appears no more hostile than our own homeworld." "That is what our ancestors believed," Sithrak said, "but I have spent the past 12 hours conducting a deeper analysis of Earth's environmental data, and what I have found disturbs me greatly." He changed the display again, and now the council chamber filled with images and statistics that made the assembled Velori click their mandibles in alarm. "Earth's axial tilt is 23 degrees, Sithrak announced, "which causes extreme seasonal variations across the planet's surface. Temperatures can range from -40 to +50 degrees depending on location and time of year, forcing species to adapt to radical environmental shifts on a regular cycle." The council members exchanged glances of concern, but Sithrak was not finished. "The planet's gravity well is 40% stronger than galactic average," he continued, "which means every creature that evolves there must develop stronger bones and muscles simply to move and survive. The humans are essentially carrying extra weight every moment of their lives." "This is concerning," Councillor Vethrix admitted, "but surely not enough to—" "I am not finished," Sithrak interrupted, and the breach of protocol made the entire council fall silent with shock. 70% of Earth's surface is covered in water," he said, "but not the clean, purified water that most species drink. This water contains a corrosive salt compound that would kill most beings who tried to consume it, forcing land-dwelling creatures to compete for limited freshwater resources." He changed the display to show Earth's atmosphere, represented as layers of colorful gas. "The atmosphere contains 21% oxygen," he announced, "a highly reactive gas that most species consider toxic, but humans breathe it constantly and have evolved biochemistry that actually requires it to function. They are essentially breathing a slow poison that their bodies have learned to use as fuel." The council chamber buzzed with alarmed clicking and chittering, but Sithrak raised a hand for silence. "But the most disturbing discovery," he said, "is the nature of Earth's ecosystem itself." The display filled with images of Earth's creatures, predators with teeth and claws, parasites that burrowed into living flesh, bacteria and viruses that waged constant invisible wars inside every organism, plants that produced toxins, and animals that had evolved immunity only to develop new weaknesses to new threats. "Earth is not a moderate world," Sithrak declared. "It is a constant battlefield where every species is locked in eternal competition for survival, where death comes from predators and disease and starvation and natural disasters that strike without warning, where the only way to survive is to adapt and overcome and never stop fighting." Councillor Vethrix rose from her seat with mandibles spread wide in an expression of dawning horror. "You are saying our classification was wrong," she said, "and it was not a question." "I am saying it was catastrophically wrong," Sithrak confirmed. "Earth does not qualify as a Class 7 world. Based on these factors, and many others I have not had time to detail, it qualifies as a Class 12 Deathworld, one of the most hostile environments in the catalogued galaxy." The council chamber erupted in chaos as the implications sank in. A Class 12 Deathworld was a designation reserved for planets that actively killed their inhabitants, environments so hostile that survival itself was considered an achievement, worlds that produced species forged in constant struggle and shaped by endless adversity. And humanity had evolved there, had thrived there, had built civilizations and developed technology and reached the stars while fighting against an environment that should have destroyed them 1,000 times over. "This changes everything," Counselor Thrix said, her voice barely audible above the noise. "If Earth is truly a death world, then the trials were never testing the humans' limits. They were simply confirming what her planet had already built into her." "Precisely," Sithrak agreed. "The burning flats simulate volcanic environments, but Earth has active volcanoes that erupt without warning. The humans' ancestors survived such events and passed that survival ability to their descendants." He changed the display to show the drowning dark. "Flooded tunnels and predatory creatures," he said. "But Earth's oceans contain predators far more dangerous than our razor eels, and humans regularly enter those waters for food and sport and exploration. They do not fear the water because they have learned to master it." The display changed again to show the isolation pods of Stage 3. "And psychological trauma," Sithrak finished. "We designed Stage 3 to break minds by confronting candidates with their worst fears, but humans live with fear constantly. Their entire evolutionary history is one of trauma and loss and survival against impossible odds." Counselor Vethrix sank back into her seat, looking older than she had moments before. "We have made a terrible mistake," she said. "We dismissed humanity as a weak species from a moderate world. We looked down on them and denied them respect. And all this time they were survivors of one of the deadliest environments we have ever catalogued. The question now," Sithrak said carefully, "is what we do with this information." The council sat in silence, contemplating a future that had suddenly become far more complicated than any of them had imagined. Meanwhile, on the Crucible, Lissa Chen rested in her quarters and prepared for Stage 4, the final challenge that would determine whether humanity would rise to Tier 1 status or remain forever beneath the notice of the galaxy's elder species. She did not know about the chaos unfolding on Station Corvth Prime, did not know that her people's classification was being debated and rewritten in real time, did not know that the Velori had finally begun to understand what it meant to be human. She knew only that she was hungry and tired and determined to see this through to the end. She dreamed of Earth that night, of blue skies and green trees and the sound of rain against windows, of storms that shook the ground and waves that crashed against shores, of all the beautiful, terrible wonders of the world that had made her people strong. And when she woke, she was ready. Stage 4 was called the Apex, and it took place in an arena that reminded Lissa of the ancient Roman Colosseums she had studied in history classes back on Earth. The structure rose in concentric circles of seating around a central pit filled with rocks and shadows, and as Lissa walked through the entrance tunnel, she could see that every seat was occupied. Velori and Morathi and Delphine, and dozens of other species she did not recognize, all gathered to witness what they expected to be the final failure of the human candidate. Ambassador Sithrak waited for her at the edge of the pit, and something in his posture had changed since their last conversation. He stood straighter and spoke more carefully, as if he were addressing an equal rather than an inferior being. "Commander Chen," he said, "Stage 4 is a combat trial against a creature called a Skorax, a gene-engineered predator designed specifically to test the survival instincts of trial candidates." He gestured toward the far end of the arena, where massive doors stood sealed against whatever waited behind them. "The Skorax has been responsible for ending the trials of over 200 candidates across 3 centuries, he continued, "and no being has ever defeated one in direct combat. The best outcome any candidate has achieved is survival long enough for the time limit to expire." "What is the time limit?" Lissa asked, studying the arena floor and noting the positions of rocks and shadows that might provide cover. "1 hour, Sithrak replied. "But I must tell you something that the Council has only recently discovered, something that may change how you approach this challenge." He leaned closer and spoke in a voice that only she could hear. "We know about Earth now," he said. We know that your world was misclassified, that you come from a death world that should have killed your species 1,000 times over, and the Council is divided about what this means for humanity's future." Lissa looked at him with eyes that showed no surprise, because she had always known what Earth was. She had simply never expected the galaxy to understand. "What does the Council want?" she asked. "Some want to grant you Tier 1 status immediately," Sithrak said, "out of respect for what your species has survived, but others fear what humanity might become if given power and resources. They argue that Deathworld species are too dangerous to be treated as equals." "And what do you want?" Lissa asked. Sithrak was silent for a long moment, his compound eyes reflecting her image 1,000 times. "I want to see what happens next," he said finally, and he stepped back as the arena doors began to open. The Skorax emerged from the darkness like a nightmare given flesh, and Lissa understood immediately why so many candidates had failed against it. The creature stood 4 meters tall on 6 legs that ended in claws like curved swords, its body armored in overlapping plates of black chitin that gleamed under the arena lights, and from its back rose a forest of spines that dripped with something that smoked where it touched the ground. Its head was a mass of sensory organs and mandibles, and it turned toward Lissa with the focused intensity of a predator that had never known defeat. The audience fell silent as the Skorax began to move, circling the arena with a grace that belied its massive size, and Lissa watched it carefully and did not run. Running was what prey did, and she refused to be prey. The creature studied her in return, perhaps confused by a candidate who did not immediately flee or cower, and Lissa used that moment of hesitation to observe its movements and identify the gaps in its armor plating. There, beneath the jaw where the chitin plates did not quite meet, a strip of exposed flesh that pulsed with the creature's heartbeat. The Skorax charged without warning, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move, and Lissa dove to the side and felt the wind of its passing ruffle her hair. She rolled to her feet and grabbed a jagged piece of metal from the arena floor, a shard from some previous battle that had been left as a potential weapon for resourceful candidates. The creature wheeled around and charged again, and this time Lissa did not dodge. She waited until the last possible second and then stepped inside its reach and drove the metal shard upward into the soft flesh beneath its jaw. The Skorax screamed, a sound that shook the arena and made the audience cry out in shock, and it thrashed its head and sent Lissa flying across the pit to crash against a boulder with bone-jarring force. She felt her shoulder dislocate on impact and heard ribs crack beneath the blow, but she forced herself to stand because the creature was not dead, was pulling the shard from its wound with one clawed leg, was turning toward her with murder in its alien eyes. Blood dripped from her nose and her vision swam with pain, but she did not fall. The Skorax charged a third time, slower now but still deadly, and Lissa knew she had only one chance left. She grabbed another shard from the ground and waited, watching the creature's movements with eyes that had been trained to track predators since childhood, and when it lunged, she threw herself forward instead of backward. She landed on its head and grabbed the spine behind its skull and held on as it thrashed and screamed and tried to throw her off, and with her one good arm, she drove the shard into the nerve cluster she had glimpsed when it raised its head to strike. The Skorax shuddered and stumbled and crashed to the ground, and Lissa rode its body down and rolled clear as it twitched and went still. The arena was silent for a long moment, and then the noise began, cheering and clicking and sounds she could not identify, the voices of 100 species reacting to something they had never expected to see. Lissa stood over the body of the creature, covered in ichor and her own blood, and she looked toward the edge of the arena where a supply crate held her reward ration pack. Her shoulder screamed in protest, and her ribs ground against each other with every breath, but she walked to the crate and sat down and opened the pack and began to eat. Ambassador Sithrak descended into the arena with medical drones trailing behind him, and he stopped a few meters away and stared at her with an expression she could not read. "You should seek medical attention," he said. "You have significant injuries that require treatment." "It can wait," Lissa replied between bites. "I am hungry, and this is the first real food I have had in days." Sithrak's mandibles clicked in a pattern of absolute bewilderment. "You just killed a Skorax in single combat," he said, "something that has never been done in the history of these trials, and you are sitting here eating a ration pack as if nothing happened." Lissa looked up at him and shrugged with her good shoulder. "I told you before," she said. "I think better when I am not hungry, and besides, I have done harder things than this." "Harder things?" Sithrak demanded. "What could possibly be harder than killing an apex predator with a piece of scrap metal?" Lissa thought about it for a moment, chewing slowly. "Surviving," she said finally. "Just surviving every day on a world that wanted to kill us. That is what humans do, Ambassador. That is what we have always done. And compared to that, your trials were just another Tuesday." The audience watched from their seats as the human finished her meal and allowed the medical drones to treat her injuries, and word spread through the galaxy that something had changed in the balance of power among the stars. Humanity was granted Tier 1 status within the cycle, and the vote was unanimous, not from admiration, but from a sudden understanding that humans were not weak beings to be pitied, but survivors of one of the deadliest environments ever catalogued. Commander Lissa Chen returned to Earth as a hero, and when reporters asked her what the hardest part of the trials had been, she thought about it for a long moment. "The coffee," she said finally. "They replicate it wrong out there, too bitter, no soul, and I spent the whole time dreaming about a real cup of coffee from a real Earth cafe." The humans in the audience laughed, and the alien observers watching the broadcast did not understand why. But they were beginning to suspect that they never would, and perhaps that was the point, that some things about humanity would always remain a mystery to species who had never known what it meant to survive on a world that wanted them dead. Lissa Chen went home and drank her coffee and looked up at the stars, and somewhere out there, the Velori were rewriting their classification systems, and the galaxy was learning to respect a species they had once dismissed as insignificant. She smiled and finished her drink, because that was what humans did. They finished what they started, no matter the cost, no matter the odds, no matter what the universe threw at them. And they were just getting started.